la tercera sección de la Cátedra Gaos, que como saben está a cargo del profesor Franz Berto. Quienes apenas se suman por primera vez, bueno, me permito recordar que el profesor Franz Berto es profesor de lógica y metafísica en la Universidad de Tractatus. También es investigador asociado en la Universidad de Ámsterdam, y entre sus publicaciones más recientes se encuentra el libro Topics of Truth, del cual nos habló la semana pasada. Entonces, en esta tercera sesión, el título de su charla es Tractatus 4.024 versus Tractatus 5.122. Y bueno, vamos a ver de qué se trata. Muchas gracias.
Title sounds better in Spanish. Okay, so this is going to be a weird talk. I've given the talk a couple of times, and I always start with the following cautionary note. So, there's some analytic philosophers who, as they get older, feel that they have to say something about Wittgenstein, even if they're not specialists of Wittgenstein. So they come up with stuff for which it's not clear to what extent they are interpreted Wittgenstein, and to what extent they're just saying whatever they like using Wittgenstein. So that's how we got Kripke's Wittgenstein on Rules in Private Language, also called Kripkenstein. Right? And now on a much smaller and less important scale, you're going to get some Franzenstein. So that's going to be me speculating on Wittgenstein. I'll try to show that there is some tension inside the Tractatus. A tension between a conception of meaning, which has become the mainstream one, in a bit of a roundabout way, and a different conception of meaning, which has not been given due attention. And that tension has given headaches to some important interpreters of Wittgenstein. We will see that. And then I will try to do a little bit of counterfactual history of philosophy. I'll try to persuade you that if only Wittgenstein had bothered to add a couple of comments or subsections to this famous section, maybe the history of semantics would have been very different from the way it has been. Okay? So this one we all know, right? We all know it by heart. It's the glorious 4.024, which says, to understand a proposition means to know what is the case if it is true. So what we understand is the meaning. So we all know that Wittgenstein is saying that the meaning or content, the propositional content, what is expressed by a sentence, is something that we understand when we know what things must be like in order for the sentence to be true, right? So meaning is given by truth conditions. Okay, that's the truth conditional view of meaning, which is kind of the mainstream view of meaning. And the first section of this talk is about how did we get from there to here, to standard possible word semantics, which is the dominant view of meaning nowadays. And it's often taken as being in line with that. But that's the view that the meaning of a sentence is given by its intention. And the intention is given in terms of possible worlds, because it's a function from possible worlds to truth values, or equivalently, it's the set of possible worlds where the sentence is true, right? This is a proposition, the content expressed by a declarative sentence according to standard possible word semantics. Okay. And you may wonder, how did we get from there to here? Because there is no mention of possible words in the Tractatus. So the possible words don't show up explicitly in the Tractatus logical philosophical. So you may wonder, how did we get from one thing to the other? And probably the person to blame is this great philosopher who, at some point in another important book, says some ideas of Wittgenstein were the starting point for the development of this method. And this is the method that the philosopher calls the method of intention and extension. And then he introduces the notion of a state description, and he says that a state description is a class of sentences which contain, for every atomic sentence, either the sentence or its negation, but not both, and no other sentences. And then he says the state descriptions represent Leibniz's possible worlds or Wittgenstein's possible states of affairs. Now that's a bit misleading, because Wittgenstein's possible states of affairs are not quite like the state descriptions introduced by these philosophers. But maybe you have guessed who the philosopher is, right? That's Carnap, of course. Okay? That's meaning a necessity. So Carnap is the one responsible for taking us from the 4024 to the idea that truth conditions are to be given as truth in a possible world conditions, or the idea that you use possible worlds to specify the conditions under which a sentence is made. And so if you take the collection of Carnapian state descriptions as something like our set of possible worlds, as we would say nowadays, then the intension of a sentence P is just a function from that to true or false, right? And so you have it. Good. Now, last week on Thursday, I tried to sell to you the idea that you find also in that book by Diablo, Aboutness, which I like so much, that possible words in a sense are not enough. We need, as he says, an independent factor in meaning, constrained but not determined by truth conditions. And I tried to sell you a version of that, which I called two-component semantics, where besides having truth conditions, in order to have a full-fledged proposition, we need something else. That's something else which I call the topic of the subject matter. And the reason for that, according to me and also according to Diablo, is that, well, sentences can be differently true. That is to say, they can be true in different ways at the same possible words. And I gave you examples like this one last week. Equilateral triangles are equiangular, 2 + 2 = 4. They are true at the same possible worlds, all of them, but they're true in different ways. And they don't seem to express the same content. They seem to say different things. For instance, because only one is about triangles and made true by how these things are, right? And that's also true for contingent sentences. All rangles are black, all non-black things are non-rangles. So there are Hempel's paradox, right? These are classically logically equivalent, so they get the same intention. And arguably they are contingent, if you think that being black is not an essential feature of rangles, but they cannot quite mean the same. For instance, one may say that different pieces of evidence confirm them. Now that's controversial in epistemology, maybe not confirmed by different pieces of evidence, but I'm one of the few maybe philosophers who think that evidence is topic sensitive too. So I do think that there are different pieces of evidence in play here. And of course, only one is about rangles, and made true by how rangles happen to be. The other one is about non-black things. So there's a difference in aboutness, in topic, in subject matter. And what the hell is aboutness? I told you things on this last Thursday, but for those who weren't here, here's another quick introduction. Aboutness is, says Diablo, the relation that meaningful items bear to whatever it is that they're on or off or that they address or concern. This is the subject matter, or as I told you the other week, I shall also call it the topic. I told you a few things about topics last week. One was that topicality, what a sentence is about, doesn't have to do only with the things referred to in the sentence. It also has to do with what one says about them. Okay, so take dog bites man, man bites dog. Here, blog an example. Okay, in both cases, we are referring to dog, man, maybe biting, but they're about different things. The topic is different. This topic is more interesting than that topic, right? And a more interesting topic is a different topic. So I told you that there are different approaches to topic. You may want to try to capture topics or subject matters by using structural propositions, for instance. Okay, the view that propositions are structured abstract objects, which are more or less made of the senses or maybe the references of the substantial constituents of the relevant sentence. So a sentence like Socrates is a philosopher is going to express the proposition that Socrates is a philosopher, and that's an abstract object. If it's a Russellian proposition, that's an abstract thing made literally of Socrates, the guy, and of the property of being a philosopher, somehow lumped together with some kind of metaphysical glue. A problem with the idea that structural propositions, at least in the mainstream accounts, capture subject matter is that the view clashes with some propaganda that I gave you last week for the idea that the truth functional connectives should be topic transparent. They should add no subject matter of their own to the sentences in which they show up. So Mary does not kiss John differs in content from Mary kisses John, in that the content of the former includes not, if you take contents to be structural propositions. That's the only difference between the two. That in one case you got not embedded in the proposition. Also, the content of Mary kisses John and Paul is jealous includes and in the structural proposition. But that's not good for aboutness, because there is no sense in which Mary does not kiss John talks about negation, or Mary kisses John and Paul is jealous talks about conjunction. Mary does not kiss John can be about Mary, or Mary and John, or what Mary is doing, or Mary is kissing John, but it's not about not. So Yabo says structural propositions let in too much. They let too much stuff sneak into propositional content for the purpose of capturing aboutness of subject matter. Okay, so anyway, there's a different tradition that approaches meaning in a way which is divergent from the one of standard possible semantics. And that tradition comes with a mereological view of meaning. It's the view that contents can be taken as having parts, as including other contents, as their proper parts, as having reminders, as capable of being fused into wholes which inherit the proper features from the parts. There are different views in mereological accounts of content, different views of subject matters, old views by Ryle, Goodman, and other people. There are more recent accounts of partial contents by Humberstone. I told you last week about David Lewis. He had this view that subject matters are given by partitions of model space. Remember the example that I gave you, which is the one that Lewis himself uses. Okay, here's a subject matter, the number of stars. Okay, that's as good as conversational subject matter as any other. It comes with a question: what's the number of stars? That question determines a partition of the totality of possible worlds, a way to split them, right? And two possible worlds end up in the same cell in the partition when they agree on the answer to the question. So all the worlds with 0 star end up in one cell, all the worlds with 1 star end up in another cell, and so on. So this is subject matter according to Lewis. It's just a way of splitting, of partitioning possible worlds. Yabo has a similar view. He has divisions rather than partitions, but the idea is more or less the same. Kip Pine has a different view. He thinks that subject matters are given by states, or as he calls them, exact truth makers. These are the subject matters of sentences. These are the things that make the sentences true. They are smaller than big possible worlds. They can be partial. They can even be inconsistent. And importantly for Kip Pine is that they are relevant for the sentences that they make. Okay, so there are lots of different approaches to subject matter. Okay, now how does that connect? How does this mereological view of meaning connect with the Tractatus? So I told you I'll try to sell the view that there's a tension in the Tractatus. And the tension pops up when Wittgenstein is in the business of giving his account of entailment or logical consequence. Sometimes he gives an account of entailment, which is easy to explain in the terms of contemporary possible word semantics, as in standard normal modern logic. But he also says other things that don't get along well with that account. So standard possible word semantics can easily make sense of the way of characterizing entailment that Wittgenstein has in 5.12 and in the first subsection. So you know what Wittgenstein said, that the subsection is supposed to be a comment or a way of unpacking what's in the section it is the subsection of. And he says that the fewer decimals you have, the more important the section is. But then he also said, oh, and here is my fundamental thought. And that's in 4 point blah, 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 with 7 decimals. Okay, so that makes sense. That. Anyway, this is 5.12. Wittgenstein says, in particular, the truth of a proposition P follows from that of a proposition Q if all the truth grounds of the second are truth grounds of the first. And then the comment to that, 5.121, is the truth grounds of Q. So he's unpacking what containment of truth grounds is, right? So he's saying the truth grounds of Q are contained in those of P. That is to say, P follows from Q. Now, the truth grounds of a sentence, says Wittgenstein elsewhere, are those truth possibilities of its truth arguments which verify the proposition. And this can be understood by the notion of logical space, which pops up in lots of places in the Tractatus. And I think the mainstream interpretation of the notion of logical space, nowadays it comes from Stenius back in the 60s, is in terms of possible worlds. So 5.2 entailment, so logical consequence as characterized there, is close enough to logical consequence as characterized in normal modern logic using standard possible world semantics. It's just truth preservation at all worlds in all models and all interpretations. Okay. But then there's this thing, the uncomfortable 5.122. Wittgenstein says that, if P follows from Q, the sense of P is contained in that of Q. And moreover, in 5.13, he says, if a proposition, let's say P, follows from another, let's say Q, then the latter, Q, says more than the former, P. The former, P, less than the latter. So here containment is the other way around, right? Because now he's saying that the entailing Q says at least whatever the entailed P said, so it includes it in some sense. Okay? So he comes up with an idea of sense containment, and he comes up with the idea that so a sentence can say more than another, so that what one sentence says can properly include what another sentence says. Okay? So there can be mereological relations between senses, or what sentences say. So what a sentence say can be a proper part of what another sentence. Now here the commentators start scratching their hands. So here's Ramsay himself. So Ramsay, when it comes to this sense containment thing, says, well, I think this statement is really a definition of containing as regards senses, an extension of the meaning of assert, partly in conformity with ordinary usage. So unpacking what we mean when we say that a sentence asserts this, which probably agrees as regards P and Q and P, but not otherwise. So it means not in other cases of entailment. So what's he saying here? So remember what I told you last week about that asymmetry between conjunction and disjunction, which according to people like Diablo or Kit Fine, it's a mark of a theory of partial content. What it means that a content is part of another one. Okay? And they both say, well, P and Q both entails and includes P. So conjunction entails the conjuncts, but also includes them. Okay. But even though P entails P or Q, it doesn't include P or Q. So P and Q in standard possible semantics entails P, but P entails P or Q in standard possible semantics, of course. And P or Q can be partly about something P is not about, namely whatever Q is about. Okay? So we got truth preservation, we would say nowadays, at all worlds in all models. Okay? We don't have preservation of subject matter or topic. Max Black is very neat. He says that self-containment is an impediment to clarity. He says that 5.122 is a peculiar and possibly unfortunate use of this word, let us say contain. He said, it would have been better if Wittgenstein had not written that at all. Self-containment is just a metaphor, says Vogelin, nothing more than that. More recently, there's a couple of Italian interpreters who try to make sense of the notion of self-containment. Antonio Negro and Lello Frascola, who wrote a fantastic introduction to the Tractatus. They propose that we look not at truth grounds, but at their complements, falsity ground, because that would explain the reversal in containment, right? So they have a negative view of content. Okay, so the content is the set of situations or circumstances in which the sentence is not true. Okay? That's an account that you find, for instance, in Antik. And then we can explain reverse containment as inclusion of falsity grounds. I'm not getting into what the interpreters have to say on this anymore. Now I'm going to get really weird, and I'm going to start embarking in my little bit of counterfactual history of philosophy. Go back to 4024. To understand the proposition means to know what is the case if it is true. Okay. Now let's pretend that Wittgenstein had bothered to add a comment to that. Okay. So that's me. I'm putting asterisks just to make it that's not Wittgenstein. So suppose he had added a gloss to 4024. So he had added 4.0241. Okay. Unpacking what it is to know what is the case. And he had bothered to say something like that. Well, knowing what is the case if a sentence is true is knowing its ways of being true. Okay. So suppose he had started to talk in terms of ways of being true. Now, one way to have a ways-based account of propositional content is precisely what you find in Wittgenstein's truth-maker semantics. And I told you last week that Wittgenstein has this very ambitious project. He wants to do everything from scratch and completely replace standard possible word semantics, replacing possible words with states or exact truth makers. I told you the joke that he has, that there are only two things which are wrong with possible words. One is that they are possible, and the other is that they are words. Okay, that's a ways-based account of propositional contents, and I would say that Wittgenstein's core idea is kind of Tractarian in spirit, because in Wittgenstein's view, sentences are made through by states of affairs or situations rather than by whole possible words. Okay, and Wittgenstein's states of affairs may look similar, at least in some interpretation, to the states of affairs of which sentences are pictures, according to the pictorial view of the Tractatus. I favor another account that I started to, another subject matter sensitive account of propositional content, which I started to introduce to you last week. I will introduce it again quickly for those who were not around last week. I told you that I call it the two-component account of content. There are many around besides mine. There are accounts by Peter Hook. Actually, the one I came up with last week was invented in cooperation with Peter. There's one that Diablo himself has in the Aboutness book. These are kind of more friendly to possible worlds, maybe, than Wittgenstein's account. So in our view, the content of P is what I called the thick proposition last week, or also directed proposition, a proposition that points, that is like a pointer towards the subject matter, what it's about. Okay, I'm using this notation now, these double brackets. Okay, that's the thick proposition expressed by sentence P. And it's made of two things. This is just the truth set of P, that's the usual intention. Okay, it's just the set of possible worlds at which P is true. So this set of worlds, that's the subset of the worlds where P is true. That's the first component. And the second is the topic, which is assigned to P. It's subject matter, what it's about. And then you get obvious accounts of same saying, same more, same less. What it means that two sentences say the same thing or express the same content. What it means that one sentence says more than the other. Whatever is expressed by the first sentence is also expressed by the second. P and Q say the same thing, of course, when first they were the same worlds, so they coincide in intention, but that's not enough because secondly, they must coincide in topic. They must be about the same stuff. And you also have an obvious account of content inclusion, what it means that the content of a sentence is included in that of another. P's content includes Q's content when first, any P world is a Q world, so P entails Q in the usual sense of payment. And second, the topic of Q is part of that of P. P says more than or at least as much as Q. Two obvious questions. A, why do you want to have two components? And B, what is the topic? A, why two components? So here's me engaging in counterfactual history of philosophy again. Here's another gloss that you may add to my hypothetical 40241. And that's a gloss that pushes more the Tractatus in the two-component direction. So remember, to understand the proposition means what? To know what is the case if it is true. What is it to know that what is the case if it is true? My hypothetical 4.0241. Knowing what is the case if a sentence is true is knowing its ways of being true. Okay. And how do you know the ways of being true? Here's my next hypothetical gloss, 4.02411. That's me again, okay? One knows how a sentence is true. One knows the ways of being true for the sentence by knowing its truth possibilities and by knowing what it's about. What's its subject matter? So you understand what P says, the content expressed by P, when first you understand what the sentence talks about, its topic or subject matter, and second, you understand what it says about that topic or subject matter. And by saying that the subject matter is such and so, it may get things right, so it may be true, or it may not get things right, so it will be false. So you understand the sentence La Neige Blanche as soon as you know that first it speaks about, well, the color of snow, what snow is like, snow's whiteness, or whatever you want the topic to be. And you also know that Q, it says that things are such and so with respect to subject matter, that is to say that snow is white. And if snow is white, then the sentence is true, otherwise it's not. P, what are topics or subject matters? Again, you may go the Kit-Fine way, and you may take them as states, and you may reduce worlds to states, which people who work on truth maker semantics sometimes do. They say, well, possible worlds are just a special case of states. They are states which are maximal and consistent. Okay. Or you may go the other way around. There's Lewis state. The subject matter of P in a certain conversational context C is given by the question of questions that P can be taken as answering to in that context. That gives the partition, that's what I already explained to you, of the set of worlds. T worlds W1 and W2 end up in the same cell in the partition when they agree in the answer. So the number of stars is 8. As its topic, the number of stars. I'm using boldface to talk about topics. It can be taken as an answer to the question how many stars are there. This splits and groups worlds by depending on how they answer the question. All 0-star worlds end up in one cell, all the 1-star worlds in another, and so on. Diablo generalizes to division, which are different from partitions because they allow overlap. So one world can be in more than one cell, which makes sense because some questions can have more than one correct answer, right? So what's the number of stars is a question that only has one good answer. Either it's 1 or 0, 1, 2, or 3, 4, so on. But some questions have more than one correct answer. For instance, when I can ask, where can I find the bed at breakfast in Kilberg, which is one of the villages where Wittgenstein ended up in Austria after he completed Tractatus, and said, okay, enough philosophy, I'm going to teach kids. It could be more than one. And so a word can be in more than one cell with respect to that question. That's why Diablo proposes a generalization to divisions. Actually, he would generalize further to covers. So he may allow not only overlap, but inclusion. That gives you a more complicating setting for subject matters. But we don't need to get there. Anyway, accounts of subject matter are at least the ones that I like, the ones in which the truth functional logical vocabulary is topic transparent. They comply with Wittgenstein's fundamental thought. That's the one that comes in the section that has 4 decimals, but it's the fundamental thought. The Wittgenstein says, that's the thought that the logical constants represent nothing, right? He says, the logic of the facts cannot be represented, which I translate as, the logical vocabulary contributes nothing to topicality. Snow is not white, must be about whatever snow is white is about. It may be the snow, the color of snow, the whiteness of snow, or whatever. Of course, the two sentences say opposite things about that same topic, but they are true at different possible worlds. And that's why the two propositions are different. But the difference is in the truth conditional component, in the set of worlds at which those contents are true. It's not a difference in aboutness, they are about the same stuff. They can be taken as answer to the same question in conversational terms. So the first guiding principle for a propositional recursion of topics, if we have a simple propositional language and we want to assign subject matters to sentences recursively, is that the topic of not P is going to be the same as the topic of P. And then, of course, also the topic of not P is the same as the topic of P. And that reminds us of other things, besides reminding us of Frege, on the fact that, on the claim that, Frege's claim that double negation preserves Sinn. Here's a view endorsed by Wittgenstein, 4.061. The sign not corresponds to nothing in reality. That negation occurs in a proposition is no characteristic of its sense. Not P equals P. And then he also says 5.44. And if there was an object called not, then not P would have to say something other than P. For the proposition would then treat off negation, the other would not. Of course, Wittgenstein would also say that you just cannot talk about that, right? That's the ineffable. I'm not going to go that far. So the fact that I say that in snow is not white, you don't talk about negation, doesn't mean that I want to say with Wittgenstein that negation is ineffable in the sense that you can't talk about the content of negation. Okay. You can say things like negation switches truth and falsity, for instance. Okay. Now you're talking about negation, but you're not talking about negation when you say snow is not white. Okay, second guiding principle for a propositional recursion on topics, P and Q and P all Q have the same subject matter. This is nothing but the fusion of the subject matter of P and that of Q. Okay. So for instance, John is told and handsome, John is told or handsome, they're about the same topic, the height and looks of Johns. So if you have that notation standing for topic fusion, that's the operation that takes any two topics and lumps them together, merges them together. The second guiding principle is that the topic of P and Q is the same as the topic of P or Q, and that's nothing but the fusion of the topic of P and the topic of P. It's just whatever P is about and whatever Q is about, lumped together. Okay. And I think I told you last week that besides my view, there's a number of other accounts of subject matter, Kip finds, for instance, that agree on this, agree on the view that the truth function, also Peter Hope's own account, is in the same ballpark. We all believe that the truth functional logical vocabulary should be topic transparent in this. Okay, now let's make things a bit more precise. Formally, I'm going to use a simple propositional language with atoms, PQR and so on, negation, conjunction, disjunction, without parentheses as auxiliary symbols. You're going to use A, B, and C and so on as meta variables for formulas. And the for formulas are the atoms and those bits. So super simple truth functional propositional language. Okay. A model for the language is tuple, which is made of 5 items. The first one, big W, is the usual non-empty set of possible worlds. The second T is an empty set of possible topics. Okay. And like last Thursday, I'm going to be very silent on what the hell these things are. I'm going to give you a very abstract account of topics. It's just going to be a little algebra. I only need them to be mergeable in the way that I will present now. The third item is an idempotent commutative associative binary operational topics. So it's topic fusion. And then we have two interpretation functions. Because remember, this is a two-component semantic. Okay, they're independent from each other. The first one, V, is a simple valuation. It assigns to each atom in the language a truth set, a set of possible worlds. Okay, that's why the thing is true. And the fifth item T, is a topic assignment function. It assigns a topic to each atom. Okay. So that's what the thing is about. Out of fusion, we can define topic parenthood, what it means that the topic of one sentence is included in another one, or that one topic is included in another. So X is part of Y, just in case the fusion of X and Y is Y. So then that makes a part to the partial ordering, and you can define the strict one from the non-strict one the usual way. Next, we extend the V function to the whole language, where the usual recursive clauses, which assign a truth set to each formula of the language, and that's all business as usual. Negation is complementation, conjunction is intersection, and disjunction is union. Nothing new here. Okay, yeah. And we also extend the topic assignment to the whole language, following our two guiding principles for a recursion of topics. So the topic of a negation should be the same as the topic of negative formula. The topic of a conjunction should be the same as that of a disjunction, which is the fusion of the topics of the juncts, conjuncts and disjuncts. That makes topics, that makes the functional vocabulary logic, the functional logical vocabulary topic transparent. And we get a fully recursive assignment now of each form to each formula of the language of a thick content, of a thick proposition. Truth set and topic. And then A and B say the same in a certain model when the thick propositions expressed by the two coincide. Same truth set, same topic. And usually define same at least as much and same strictly more accordingly. Now, this is semantics which is hyperintentional. It's strictly more fine-grained than standard possible semantics. For instance, that, not A, not A, and that, B or not B, these express different thick propositions, even though they're both tautologies. It's not the case that the lag is both true and non-true. It doesn't say the same as either Goldbach's conjecture holds or not. Only one is about Goldbach's conjecture. They differ in topic, even though the truth set is the same. Still, lots of sentences turn out to express the same thick proposition. A and B says the same as B and A. It's raining and cold today. It's cold and rainy today. They say the same thing. A says the same as not A. Mary's on time says the same as Mary isn't late. More controversially, maybe you got the Morgan equivalence. The Morgan-ish equivalence is not A or not B says the same as not A and B. Either Mary doesn't like John or she doesn't like Paul says the same as Mary doesn't like both John and Paul. And now here's the definition of logical consequence of entailment. Read that as B follows from A or A entails B, which embeds topic containment and which is a claim in the spirit of the uncomfortable 5.122 of the Tractatus. The thick proposition expressed by A includes the thick proposition expressed by B. I'm going to use that notation. It says that the same impact. When first, A entails B in the usual sense, all the words where A is true are words where B is true. But second, the topic of B is included in the topic of A. Okay, so propositional content inclusion is entailment plus topic inclusion. And there you have it. 5.124. A proposition affirms every proposition that follows from it. And if one proposition follows from another, then the latter says more than the former, and the former says less than the latter. 5.14. Now this makes sense. We have precise characterization of same saying, saying more, and so on. In particular, A entails B in a model, if and only if the content of A includes that of B in that model. A says at least as much as B there, and you can define entailment in this sense as content inclusion when A entails B in each model. Okay, now, of course, not all of the Tractatus can be made consistent with a topic-sensitive account of content, whether of the two-component kind, the one that I like, or a different kind, let's say the kit-find maker approach. Often the Tractatus pulls in an opposite direction. So I'm not saying that I'm giving you a new interpretation that allows you to make sense of everything that people can claim, some sense inclusion, entailment, and so on. For instance, here's a section that clearly goes the other way. 4.465, where Wittgenstein says the logical product of a tautology and a proposition says the same thing as the proposition. Therefore, that product is identical with the proposition. So A says the same in this view as A and B are not B, right? Of course, that's all, since for the Tractatus, all tautologies are zealous. Okay? They are not unsinnig. You know, Wittgensteinians have this debate on the distinction between unsinnig, zealous, there's the new Wittgenstein and so on. I'm not gonna get that. But if you stick to my account of thick propositions, they are different thick propositions, right? Because it needn't be the case that the topic of A is the same as the topic of A and B or not B. This may be a bigger topic, as it may include whatever B is about. It may also be that the interpretation of sense containment in the Tractatus in terms of inclusions of falsity grounds, as Antonio has it, Negro, does a better job than my little two-component semantics in making sense of the whole Tractatus, logical, philosophical story. And now I depart from Wittgenstein. It's the thing proposition view that gets it right. How can Jane fell out of bed say the same as Jane fell out of bed and either John is 6 feet tall or not? Only the latter is partly about John's height. Mary may have brought it about that Jane fell out of bed without bringing it about that Jane fell out of bed and either John is 6 feet tall or not. That's an old example due to Perry. Okay, she didn't bring that about. That was already the case. She didn't make it the case. Okay. So to conclude, it just seems to me reasonable to say that standard possible semantics, at the very least, is not obviously straightforwardly mandated by the account of content that we find in the Tractatus. Nor are therefore the problems of standard possible semantics that I started to mention last week. Of course, Ramsey of Black had a hard time coordinating what the Tractatus says about sense containment in 5.122 with the direction that it takes elsewhere. I'm more puzzled by the fact that authoritative interpreters of Wittgenstein and of the Tractatus saw the merely to put conditional direction as the default one, and they treated the other one, the content containment direction, as the one which shouldn't have been there or should have been treated as a mere metaphor. And because I have a few minutes more, here's another gloss showing that Wittgenstein himself, he hadn't made up his mind at the time when he was reading the Tractatus. That's a quote from the Nachlass. You can find it in that paper that I already referred to by Antonio Martínez, who, by the way, is an amazing interpreter of Wittgenstein. So there's this passage in the Nachlass in which Negro argues Wittgenstein himself shows that he later admitted that his ideas around sense containment were less than fully clear when he wrote the Tractatus. So he goes back to the Tractatus, and Wittgenstein says, if the proposition Q follows from the proposition P, then I thought, and he meant at the time when he wrote the Tractatus, that P and not Q has to be a contradiction. And these I saw quite rightly. And I said, I believe that I had to further infer from this that Q in some sense had to be contained into the sense containment. If both propositions had nothing to do with each other, how could P and not Q be a contradiction? Right? The other view that the atomic sentences must be isolated, right? In what sense Q is supposed to be contained in P does not yet emerge from this. And I did not clearly specify it. And again, he's saying when I wrote the Tractatus. There is a clear sense in saying Q is contained in the logical product P and Q. So it seems to me that quotes like this give some evidence that Wittgenstein, at the time when he wrote the Tractatus, had clearly the idea of A and B's entailing a case, but he could not see how to generalize it. And that's because he was oscillating between those two views of sense containment. The one which is more friendly to standard possible semantics, and the other one which is more friendly to a mereological view of content. Okay, that's what I have to say. Thanks a lot. Okay, we may have a 10-minute break or a little break. Yeah, and then we go for the questions.
May we start again? Hey, we're restarting now. You're going back. Okay, so we're resuming the second part of Franz's talk. We have time for Q&A, and we have already several hands raised. So please accept. Yeah, I saw your hand.
Okay, good. Thank you. Now this is great. Like all the times. Thank you. And I was really surprised, gladly surprised at how you use the show-tell distinction for your purposes, right? So that aboutness is the tell part. But as you say, this creates a tension within your interpretation of Wittgenstein because the show part. What is it? I mean, presumably, or at least what I would think, and a lot of other Wittgenstein scholars would think, is that what you show somehow would also have to be included in the topic, at least. I mean, because when you show something, right, the sentence that you use to show, say, the logical form of a sentence or the conceptual relation, blah, 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 seems to be about that logical form or that you are showing, right? But in your theory, that cannot happen because you can only talk about logical forms by explicitly mention them, right? So no sentence can be about logical form, but that means that no sentence, what the sentence can show will never be what it is about.
Right.
Right? And you would buy the bullet.
Totally. Yes. So of course, Wittgenstein would, but that's neither here nor there in the debate between standard possible word semantics and people like us. So
why?
Well, I'm making a mess of the saying showing distinction. Wittgenstein would say.
Yes.
Because Wittgenstein would say, well, negation is about nothing. Whereas I'm saying negation is topic transparent, but I don't want to claim that we cannot talk about whatever negation is about. Yes. I think that we can say things like negation is a two-place operator, and Wittgenstein would not follow me down the line, of course. Okay, but I never claimed that I wanted to be in agreement with everything that Wittgenstein says in the Tractatus. I wanted to show that there's a tension inside the Tractatus between a more truth-conditional account of meaning and another one which takes into account a mereological view of content. And when it's about disagreeing with Wittgenstein on the say showing distinction, I am in the same boat as the other people, the fans of standard truth conditional semantics, because they also think that what you cannot speak about in a language, you can speak in a meta language or whatever you like. So they also make a mess of the saying showing distinction. So the whole Montague and so on possible with semantics is built on the idea that you can speak about the semantics of language and give a semantic of language. Yeah. Okay, which Wittgenstein would have said that's what you cannot do. So they do what according to Wittgenstein cannot be done. I do what according to Wittgenstein cannot be done, and that's just how it is. So yeah, I'm not following Wittgenstein down the line of the ineffable and so on, not at all. And neither are the other people who have developed standard possible worlds truth conditional semantics.
Can I push a little bit further? So you don't need to like answer to Wittgenstein's arguments or reasons for this claim that you cannot talk about logical form or things like that, just because that is not whom you're arguing against.
Yeah, maybe I need to, but then I'm in the same boat as the other ones. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Santiago?
Yes, thank you very much. It was a great talk. I have two questions. One in counterfactual history philosophy.
Yeah.
And the second about your development of counterfactual history.
Yeah.
So the first question is about your amendment.
Yeah.
And my question is, what should Wittgenstein change in his ontology so that he could add that knowing what is the case, if a sentence is true, is knowing ways of being true. So how could he accommodate ways of being true? So he should have probably revised the things he said before. So my question is, could he just add that, or would he be compelled to change things in his ontology and pictorial theory of meaning? So that's the first question. And the second question is about your development of that idea, because that relates to something that Axel asked last time, and that I was also asking last time when we finished, is the use of conjunction.
Yeah.
In your account of knowing how a sentence is true. What about thinking about that dependency relation? So one might think that you know how a sentence is true, and somehow knowing what it is about comes first. And because if you have a conjunction, I think your theory predicts that you could have one without the other. And maybe that's my intuition. I don't have a super strong defense of that. I have the intuition that knowing aboutness comes first somehow.
Oh, okay.
And only when you get that, then maybe you start to talk about possibilities.
Got it. Good. Maybe I can lump the answers to the two questions together, because maybe Wittgenstein would not need to change anything in his ontology. Maybe he could stick to the view that a sentence is a picture of a state of affairs. And that would be enough for a theory of content which is sensitive to ways of being true. It would be more on the Kit-Fine, in the Kit-Fine ballpark, because, so I told you that Kit-Fine states, they look a little bit like Wittgenstein states of affects. And so the story then would be, well, and that can be interpreted as a one component semantics, because I think in those exact truth maker approaches, the truth maker, the state, is at the same time what the sentence is about, so the subject matter, and also what makes it true. Kit-Fine may not like to spell out the thing in terms of truth conditions, so he sometimes says, I don't want to talk about giving truth conditions by states, but that's just because he thinks that that's terminology which is too loaded. It's the way people who do standard possible semantics talks. But it kind of makes sense, I think. So if you have a subject matter sensitive semantic of the Kit-Fine kind, well, then you got those states which are very much like the states of affairs of which sentences are pictures. They have the senses also, according to Wittgenstein. You have them in your ontology. They play both the role of what makes the sentence true, if the state of affairs obtains, and also of being what the sentence is about, the subject matter. So if you have that kind of ways-based semantics, it seems that you don't even need to change too much your ontology. If you're Wittgenstein, you just have your states of affairs. And on the other thing, yeah, if you think that understanding what the sentence is about comes first and in some sense completely determines the other bit, then again you're in the ballpark of one component subject matter sensitive account of content. If what you mean is that you think that subject matter fixes truth conditions. If you only mean, oh, you need to understand subject matter first, in order to then grasp the truth condition, maybe you don't want to, okay. Then I don't know. I think that you can sometimes understand the truth conditions of a sentence even if you don't grasp what the sentence is about. Yeah. I need to come up with some example, but I think that can happen.
Okay. Now it's Ricardo's turn.
Yeah. What about just a tautology where, following up,
yeah.
What about just a tautology where you just don't understand the sentences really, but you understand the logic?
Yeah, it would be a case like that.
Yeah.
If I say either Socrates is Babig or Socrates is not Babig, yeah. I understand the truth conditions because I know that that's going to be true in all possible worlds. But I have no idea what you're talking about in the sense that I don't know what Babig is. Usually that I'm not in the world. That would be an example.
A little more.
Yeah.
So
I mean,
maybe you could end up having a disunified account. So for tautologies, you can get both separate, but there might be whole classes of sentences where you have a dependency relation.
Yeah.
So I was thinking about proper names or.
So in the book, chapter 2, I have the topics of thought book. Peter and I come up with a couple of examples in which we try a couple of cases in which even epistemically ideal speakers sometimes grasp the truth conditions, but they are not positioned to extract from that the subject matter, and the other way around. But I forgot the examples. So I have them in the book. I can come up with them. Yeah, I think that the one on not going from subject matter to truth condition. So from truth conditions to subject matter is of that kind. It's a tautology, you can tell it from the logical form. So you know the truth conditions, but you cannot extract what the sentence is about. Yeah.
Yeah, so I have a question about understanding. It actually may be related to this. So you claim that to understand P, you need to understand the intention of P and the topic.
Yeah.
Right? I'm wondering, how does one get the understanding part? I was guessing that maybe a compositional process of sorts, but then I'm wondering, how would you describe this well-known critical case where suppose that Gödel really didn't prove the incompleteness theory, it was Smith, and when I use the name Gödel, I associate the description, the person who proved the incompleteness of arithmetic. I know what the referent of the name is Gödel himself, is not Smith, but despite that, I associate this incorrect descriptive information. So if I were to say Gödel is in the coffee shop, do I understand the topic despite me just associating a bunch of garbage information with the sentence? Because I was worried if it's a compositional process, I should get the topic right? Because I know what's the reference of Gödel, and I can extract the topic from there. But then if you were to question me about the topic, I'm going to produce a lot of information that may not be correct. So do I understand the topic? Do I don't?
Good. That's an awesome question. So the short answer is going to be very anticlimactic. I have no idea. The long answer is this. So that crucially involves the topics of subsentential components of sentences. It has to do with the fact that it's the usual critical case. So there's a sense in which you know what Kurt Gödel means, because you pick the referent the right way, because you intend to refer to whoever was originally so baptized, but you associate the wrong descriptions that, and that's your problem. It's not about the semantics of the name. The theory of subject matter, in the theory of subject matters, theories of subject matter which have been developed, the work on the subject, so what the subject matter of the subsentential components of sentences, like names, is still very much in its infancy. The only thing on which there's an amount of agreement is that, so if subject matters are constituents of content, they better be compositional, and there's an amount of agreement on the composition, how compositionality works in just a simple propositional case, so negation, conjunction, and abstraction. But when you move to the compositionality for the subsentential components of sentences, it's a total mess. There's only a couple of works. Peter Hook has an account of subject matter for a first order language with names and predicates, and it's very Freudian. So he associates senses with names. And then things work in the right way compositionally, but Peter himself is worried because the account is very Freudian, so it's in danger of coming into the territory where the Freudian objections or the objections of the millions who want names just to, the meanings of name just to be the denotations start to strike. So yeah, the literature is still very tentative on that. And also the intuitions on subject matter in cases that involve co-referential names are kind of shaky in a way in which I think they're not for cases like where I diverge from Wittgenstein. Yeah. Jane fell out of bed, and either John is 6 feet tall or not. I think that's intuitive that they're about different things. That's intuitive to me. But when you have sentences like, Lois Lane loves Superman, Lois Lane loves Clark Kent. It's not clear that they are about different things. Maybe they're about the same thing, namely Calais. So when you have these cases of failure of substitution for co-referential names, it's not clear that it's the job of topics or subject matters to account for that. Maybe you still need to resort to guises or modes of presentation and so on. I don't have a view of this. If you follow the account that Peter Hoek has developed, then you can make those distinctions by using subject matters, because he has this rich account of subject matters in which names have senses and those are constituents of the subject matters and so on. But I'm neutral on this because that's why I said I have no idea. Yeah, so there's no settled reply to the question that you raised in current accounts of subject matters. Yeah.
Abraham?
Yes. Can you go to the slide where you have the documentation and the things? Well, everything information. Yeah. You said that A and not A are about the same topic.
Yeah.
The same. Okay. Yeah. I was thinking in maybe an example could be restrictive. What about the intuitionist logician when he says that you have a proof A and you don't have a proof that A is false?
Right.
So there is a difference between the first and the second negation.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Good. So if you're in the intuitionistic logician, I can easily accommodate your tastes because so this is two component semantics, and one component is just standard classical truth conditions given in terms of possible worlds. When you add topic as I have it, you get this. Okay, so they express the same content. But if you're an intuitionistic logician, you can just change the truth conditional component and come up with an intuitionistic logic and semantics. So now A and not A are not truth conditionally equivalent for you because you have a different view of negation. Still, you don't need to change the topic component. So you can easily accommodate several non-classical logics in that way. Yeah, that's how I would fix it. The topic, this came up last week, and I was saying to Louis, I don't mean that you can accommodate the views of any non-classical logician. You may have relevant logicians who just don't like the idea that you have two components and that you capture topicality by an independent second component. They may want to capture everything with their account of relevance. Okay, but when you're in an intuitionist, just take away standard possible semantics, putting, I don't know, Kripke semantics for intuitionistic logic. That's going to give you the truth conditional component, and then you have it.
Thank you. Miguel Ángel?
Thank you. So I'm coming back to the question that I made the first day.
Yeah.
That you asked me, wait until the
Now I have time.
And it's terrific because I think I understand how everything would work.
Yeah.
So you have like two components. What you seem to claim, correct me if I'm wrong, is that meaning is more fine-grained than possible worlds, but truth is as far as fine-grained as possible worlds.
Exactly.
And then
I mean, truth conditions. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry.
Yeah.
Then what I wanted to capture is a meaning whose truth condition is more fine-grained than possible worlds. So like I am bald. So imagine that for whatever reason we want to capture same content. When I think I'm bald, you think I'm bald. True in this case, more or less, and false in yours. So in this case, the possibilities, the way in which possibilities are restricted is what is more fine-grained. So possibilities are not just set of words, and that's irrelevant on the issues of topicality.
Yeah.
So we have like two ways in which when we can go hyperintension. So we can go hyperintentional if I'm just improvising, so you just tell me whether I'm making sense of everything correctly. We would be hyperintentional if we think that possibilities are more fine-grained than possible worlds. And we can be hyperintentional if we say that meaning, regardless of truth conditions.
That's exactly right.
And so this tool cannot accommodate my case, but can be switching. So, okay, whatever. I just switch my semantic worlds for
Sentence
individuals.
words here, for instance, if you like, and then you do the say stuff. And
So
that would be the way to go. Again, these are classical possible worlds. You may want to change that and have intuitionistic construction in its place. These are already more fine-grained than classical possible worlds. Or you may want to have situations, partial states, inconsistent words. The question is always, when you fine-grain this component on its own, does it do all the distinction at some point that you want? Does it make all the distinction so that this one becomes redundant? That's an interesting question, because if you have a strictly one component, fine-grained, topic-sensitive view of content, you may say, oh, I don't need this thing anymore. I can just fine-grain my truth-conferring circumstances as much as I like. And I've been exploring that, because if you have, I work on impossible worlds as well, and you can have crazy open worlds which are not closed under any either notional or logical consequence, and you already get a super fine-grained account of content just by having those beasts in your semantics. So that at some point it seems like this one doesn't do any work anymore. But would you want to go there? So even a crazy guy like me that doesn't like to allow any kind of crazy possible words in the semantics. So yeah.
Now, with this tool in hand, would you please give me an idea of what would be required in case of contingent truths? So it's clear for me. You are always appealing to necessary claims. So what would be an idea that once this tool is in play, we still require the topicality? Of course, we capture something, and I'm happy, like difference in meaning.
But I think that there are lots of contingent sentences which are co-intentional, and for which you want to make a distinction in terms of subject matters. So one example that I gave here was all ravens are black, or no, all non-black things are no ravens. I think only one is about ravens, but it's contingent. Let's say that all ravens are black. Another one is take snow is white. Suppose that it's contingent, and it is true that snow is white. Yeah, co-intentional, right? We're the same possible worlds, because snow is white if and only if it is true that snow is white. And you can stick a box in front of that. Okay? Same intention, but only one is about the proposition. It is true that snow is white. That's about the proposition. Snow is white. That's not about proposition. It's about snow. So the topic is different. And these are two contingent, co-intentional sentences. You may even not understand what a proposition is. Okay, so you may understand one without understanding the other.
Did you have a follow-up, or is that different?
Different.
Okay, then Axel, please.
Yeah, but I want to go back to the long question. Because
Axel always has a smile on his face, and then he comes up with a killer question.
I really like this a lot. Back to 4.02411 star.
Oh yeah, that's my hypothetical additions.
So this may be mostly a clarificatory question. Because knowing its truth possibilities, what does that mean? Does it mean like knowing which are its truth possibilities, but then it would also require knowing whether they obtain, right?
No.
No. Okay.
Well, you only need to know the truth conditions to understand the meaning of the sentence. You don't need to understand.
Because
you know whether the sentence is true.
Okay.
That's just like standard.
So knowing how a sentence is true means like which ways the sentence can be true.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah. Okay. So you don't need like a theory of. Okay. There is another way to asking the question. What's the relationship between topics, these entities in your model, and the possibility of there being other entities that are ways of being true or something? They're like a relation between these two sets.
So I think you already came up with something like that last week. So in the two-component account that I favor, there may be lots of relations which are left completely unexplored because I have this super abstract account of topic. It's just a set. It's just an algebra. It's just a little joint semi-lattice. So it's super. I say nothing else. But there is no function from truth conditions to topics and vice versa. But if you stop here and you're more friendly to one component, subject matter sensitive accounts of content, then it's the same kind of entities that do both jobs. And I think that's a natural way of understanding the Kit find truth maker approach, because he states they do both things at once. They are what makes the sentence true, and they're also what the sentence is about. I'm not completely confident in saying that, because I think I mentioned I got reports from referees who are clearly fans of truthmaker semantics are fine, and who claim that you can read truthmaker semantics as a two-component account. I don't know. If they say so, it looks like a one-component semantic to me, but yeah.
Well, just to follow. Yes. Okay, so then what was your answer to the previous worry about what happens when somebody knows the truth possibilities of a sentence, knows that they obtain, and yet doesn't know what it's about? So that person doesn't know how the sentence is true, even if it knows that it's true. Is that what you want to say about those cases?
So the person knows that the sentence is true.
Yeah.
The person knows the truth conditions. The person doesn't know what the sentence talks about.
Yes.
And from the knowledge of the truth conditions, the person cannot recover a priori,
yes,
that to say, just by thinking hard about those truth conditions, what the sentence is about. She cannot do it, the person cannot do it without additional empirical information. Yeah, one example was, I know the truth conditions of either Socrates is Babig or not, but I have no idea what Babig means. And there's no way that by thinking hard about the truth conditions, which I'm on top of, I'm going to recover the subject matter, right?
Good.
Yeah. And it has nothing to do with my cognitive limitation. Even a godlike agent who knows the truth conditions there is not going to be able, without additional empirical information, to recover what the hell one is talking about.
So that person doesn't understand sense.
It doesn't grasp the proposition in my sense, expressed by the sentence. It only grasps the part, the truth conditions.
Good. Thank you.
Maria, please.
Thank you. I think I have a follow-up on that question as well. But so you are going to correct me if I am mistaken in this. I was thinking about an example that was not logically true or logically false, structurally, and in which you could know the truth conditions of a proposition, but you don't understand what the topic is. And so I was thinking more in the cases of science, when you have a theory or a model that is already well known or understood, logically speaking, then you get a prediction of an entity, but you don't know what the entity really is about. So an example could be in the 1940s, Bowley predicted that Berkeley K was a phenomenon that could be explained if we agree to the existence of neutrinos. But what the history of science has shown is that neither at that point, nor maybe now, we don't have a grasp of what neutrinos really are. Nonetheless, because of the model, we have the truth conditions, in a sense, very well set of how this proposition of existence of neutrinos might be true or not, even if we don't know what neutrino is, how they behave, and so on. Would that count as an example? Because it involves empirical information in a sense that
I don't think that, so there's a sense of knowing what neutrinos are here, which seems to me to be stronger than what is required to grasp the subject matter of sentences in which the word neutrino shows up. I think we can grasp sentences like neutrinos, blah, blah, blah. We understand what it's about, even if we don't know in the sense that maybe it's crucial for your example what neutrinos are. So we don't know in the sense that we don't We don't know how they behave. We're not even sure whether there are such things and so on. So yeah, I'm not sure if it's in the same ballpark. What would count as knowing what neutrinos are in this view?
No, but for instance, in this case, the problem was at the very beginning that they didn't know whether it was just one particle or if it was a set of particles or an interaction or something. So they ideally supposed that it was one particle that they called neutrino, but the exploration of what it could be lasted for 30 years before they designed an experiment. So, and the reliability of the claim came from the logical and empirical constraints of the model that, in a sense, gave the true conditions of that claim being true.
It's a difficult question. I don't know what to say because that involves sophisticated philosophy of science views. I don't know, theoretical terms introduced in a theory. In what sense we grasp what they mean, in what sense we don't. But I don't know what to say. I think that subject matter theory is still at the more primitive stage than that. So far we've only been talking about understanding what a sentence is about in a sense in which a layman can use the sentence competently and so on. So we are way more primitive than sophisticated accounts of what the meaning of a theoretical term introduced in a scientific theories and so on. I don't quite know what to say about such cases because I think in the background of your question are sophisticated views on how a theoretical term which is introduced in a scientific theory works and so on. We're more into John is happy, Jack is blue, John loves Maggie and so on still.
Thank you.
Ricardo.
Thanks. So first I was going to ask you a question and I didn't, but now after you replied to the question I did ask, now I want to ask. So I was thinking like some people think that, semantics is about truth, reference, entailment. And from that perspective, one may ask, well, why do you want to have topics like as part of the semantics? And the reason why I didn't ask that question is because I thought, probably the topics are going to help us deal with propositional attitude reports, and then that has to do with the truth conditions of certain sentences. But then, as a reply to my question, you say that it looks like topics shouldn't distinguish between the topic of Clark Kent is at the coffee shop and Superman is at the coffee shop. And if that's the case, then now it's not obvious to me how topics help with propositional attitude reports, or at least with the nasty cases. Nice. And
so all of tomorrow's lecture is going to be about that. Actually, like half of the book. So half of the book, Topics of Thought, is about starting with that account of content that I've been sketching today and last week, and add propositional attitude descriptions. And I'll try to show you tomorrow that there's lots of situations in which you have ascriptions like John knows that P, Mary believes that if P then Q, then a conditional belief, Akiko supposes that P and so on, where you can do lots of things by assuming that P or Q are thick propositions in this sense. One thing you cannot do, or not in the account that I present in the book, because it's an account that only does propositional, epistemic, doxastic logic, is modeling things like Lois Lane loves Superman, but Lois Lane doesn't love Clark Kent. But I can model lots of other things, like you can model how John can believe that P without believing that P or Q, because John lacks the concept that Q. Or you can model a certain notion of knowledge, which fails exactly. So it's not logically. So it's not doesn't satisfy full epistemic closure. So John knows that P entails Q. John doesn't know that Q, and it fails closure exactly in the cases that you need to cordon off skeptical objections and so on. So it's an answer to the so-called problem of epistemic closure. So the tension between the idea that knowledge should be closed under logical consequence, but you wanna block skeptical arguments like brain in a vat and so on, and lots of other things. So I claim that there are lots of things that you can do with knowledge ascriptions of knowledge, belief, supposition, other propositional aptitudes, by having this topic-sensitive account of content.
Okay.
Yeah, lots and lots of them. I'm going to talk about that for 1 hour tomorrow.
All right.
Well, there's a question by Luis.
Yes. Can you go back to the slide about the logical product of proposition?
Oh, yeah. What I disagree with hard with Wittgenstein. Yeah. Let's get the. I'm going to take a bit. Oh, there you go. Yeah.
So, yes, when you think about proposals like Floridi and Marcello D'Agostino's, that's
Italian mafia, yeah.
So, look, it is not that there is a difference in content or topic between A and the conjunction between A and this excluded middle, because this excluded middle is not about grass or anything, because it's true of everything. So it's not about anything in particular. So they are fully classical, yes. But then they must explain the difference, in particular cognitive difference, or propositional attitudes that we have about these two formulas. And they say, well, maybe it's just about the complexity of things, not about the topic. It's the complexity that it's playing the role of producing this difference.
So do they mean that
think about this kind of about, for accounting?
So do they mean that they mean the syntactic complexity? Or the complexity of what?
Something like syntactic complexity.
So do they claim that the syntactic complexity is supposed to explain how there's a cognitive difference or something like that between the?
At least partially.
Okay. So I claim that I don't know. The liar is not both true and false, and either John is happy or John is not happy, which are both tautologies, are different in content, and they differ in content because of what they are about. And I don't think that has anything to do with the syntactic complexity. Well, maybe the syntactic complexity is not quite the same in these two cases, but it doesn't matter. I can come up with another example. There are lots of tautologies, B or not B, C or not C, whatever, which differ just because they differ intuitively in what they are about. And the syntactic simplicity or complexity doesn't matter at all. That doesn't go out that there are lots of cognitive differences that have to do with the syntactic complexity of co-intentional claims. You can have a very long and complicated functional tautology, which is whose syntax is difficult to parse for us. Okay, and so it happens that my students, when I teach them basic logic, and I give them Frege's law. Okay, so if P, then if Q, then R, then if P, then Q, then if Q, then if P, then R, and they do to table, and they say, "Oh, that's a tautology." You don't know, and it's a surprise. So it's a cognitively relevant phenomenon, and it has to do with the syntactic complexity of the thing. But I don't think that you can explain all differences in content which are about intuitive about the different subject matter by resorting to syntactic complexity. In some cases, the syntactic complexity doesn't play any role at all. Yeah.
Okay. Well, now we have another question.
Sorry, another one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking, I'm gonna chain up with the big long question. I was thinking about the distinction, the distinction between speaker meaning and natural meaning.
Right.
Let's suppose that there are two brothers. Some say both are thinking about the color of snow. So one says snow is white. The other one said grass is white. I think you already answered this, but both know that they are talking about the same topic.
Yeah.
And have to both with the same
Yeah.
conditions.
Yeah, that's a classic case, speakers meaning.
Yeah. But a third person hearing the conversation cannot know and assign different topics to what they're saying. So this helps. What are your thoughts on this distinction? How it can be included in the semantics representation?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that theories of subject matter have a lot of significance to add to the standard way of making a distinction between speaker's meaning and semantic meaning. So I don't think we have a lot of new things to say on that. The only thing I'd say on that is if somebody has a strategy that tries to explain away all the hyperintentional distinctions which according to us belong to content by saying, oh, those are just cases in which you have a discrepancy between speakers meaning, that's not going to work. That's what I want to say. Okay, yeah. So yeah, an example. What's an example I can? It's like if I ask you, mention a feature of all equilateral triangles, and you say 2 + 2 = 4. You cannot get away by saying, oh, what I uttered expresses the one necessary proposition, the total set of worlds. And they say, oh, this is a speaker meaning, but I meant that thing. That's not gonna work. Okay. You just gave the wrong answer. So what you said is not a good answer to the question that I asked. Okay. So yeah, that's all I want to say on the distinction. Don't try to explain away all the hyperintentional distinctions that we subject matter semanticists put at the level of content by saying, oh, you cannot always explain them away as distinctions between speaker's meaning and semantic meaning.
Okay, we have 10 minutes and 3 questions, so we need to make it short. And we're going to
Yeah, very quickly, it's just an invitation to see whether I can get something more on topics, on the nature of topics. So those has to be somehow the kind of thing that needs relation of inclusion. So we're thinking of them as sets, or they have to be things with parts, or I failed to see or alternative. And why thinking that they have to be included, some sort, sometimes relations of entailment concept or something like that might work. And also one curiosity, why couldn't have cases where we didn't have complete inclusion, but only just
that's right.
Some sort of intersection, and that intersection is all that matters for the meaning. And there might be still a difference in the topic, but this doesn't matter at all. So somehow related to the things that were mentioned before.
I think it makes sense to say that topics can be parts of larger topics, can be included in other topics, can overlap. Examples where mathematics as a conversational topic that can include arithmetic, or one can say that mathematics and philosophy overlap, and the overlap includes logic, maybe, something like that. And that's why, for instance, sentences. So conversational contexts have a topic. When we are talking about something, we address some issue, that's the topic. Given a conversational topic, a sentence can be fully on topic, for instance, or it can be only partly on topic, or it can be completely off topic. So I don't know, if we are talking about Mary's profession, so the question underlying the discussion is, what's Mary's job? And I say snow is white, that's completely off topic. If I say Mary's happy, that's kind of partly off topic, because I'm talking about Mary, but I'm not quite addressing the question, which is the conversational topic, because somebody may say, yeah, that was not the question about Mary. It was we were inquiring about the profession. If you say she's happy, that's not quite on topic. Or I can say Mary's a lawyer, and that's fully on topic. It makes sense to say that sentences can be partly on topic, fully on topic. And what is it for a sentence to be partly on topics? Maybe it's to have a part which is fully on topic. That's an idea which has been developed. It's also partial to it. It's something like that. I'll get back to this too tomorrow. But once you start thinking in terms of subject matters or conversational topics as having parts, and so you start thinking methodologically. It's easy to come up with examples of sentences which can be fully on topic, partly on topic, which means that they have a part which is on topic, and so on. Yeah. So again, if the conversational topic is Mary's profession, and I say, oh, Mary is happy and snow is white, that's a strange claim to make, because it's only, the conversational topic is Mary's profession, and I say, Mary is a lawyer and snow is white. That's a very strange claim to make, because it's only partly on topic, right? The first conjunct is on topic, the second conjunct is completely off topic. So the whole sentence is as a part which is wholly on topic, and it has a part which is wholly off topic. If I say Mary is a lawyer and happy, that's a bit better, because it has one conjunct which is fully on topic and the other conjunct which is partly on topic. So you can make sense of these relations, I think. Yeah.
Thank you. Adonai?
Yeah. I have an extremely basic question. I'm sorry about that.
They're the difficult ones usually.
I'm sorry.
Usually they are the most difficult ones. Let's see.
No, it's really basic. Can you go back to point 4 where you say two ways to waste?
Point 4. So section 4 of my.
Section 4, 4.0, 0241 start.
Oh, that's me adding crazy stuff to Wittgenstein, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That one?
Yes, I really have a extremely basic question about that. If I understood you correctly, the first star refers to one component semantics.
Oh, yeah. Well, not quite. Yeah, go on. So.
Well, if that's the case, and the second one would refer to the two component semantics because it includes the about, right? That would be my.
No, not quite. What I say is that this first gloss that I propose pushes the idea of a ways-based semantics. So you know what is the case if a sentence is true. That is to say, you know the meaning of a sentence, and part that is, you know its ways of being true. But it doesn't tell you a lot on the ways of being true yet. And those ways of being true could be like keep-find states of truth makers, or they could not be that. This one is the second gloss that pushes that in the direction that I like, the component, and now you are unpacking ways of being, knowing ways of being true as knowing two things: the truth possibilities, which for me are just a set of possible words for sentences, and the topical subject matter. That's more clearly in the two component direction. This one is, I think, more neutral. Oh, okay, yeah. That pushes a two component, subject matter sensitive view of content, or a way-based view of content, without going clearly in one direction, the one that I like, rather than the other. It's kind of, you know how the Tractatus unpacks things. Blah 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 is blah blah blah. And what is blah blah blah? Blah 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 is blah blah blah. What is blah blah blah? Blah blah is blah blah blah. Right? Like the word is everything that is the case. What is that in the case? What is the case is blah blah blah. The state of fact. What is the state of fact is blah 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 blah, and so on. I'm trying to unpack things in a similar fashion.
Yeah. I'm following a little bit on that. My question actually was if when it says what is it about, would be an interpretation or an unpacking of what is the case. I don't know. On the Wittgenstein one, the first one.
Yeah, I mean, to understand the proposition is to know what is the case. Okay. And what is it to know what is the case if the proposition is true? First gloss, which twists the account in the direction of a subject matter sensitive content or a way-based, well, is to know the ways of being true. And what the hell are the ways of being true that you know? If you like my way of unpacking the idea of ways of being true, you're going to say, well, you know the ways in which a sentence is true when you know two things: the truth possibilities, the intention, and also the subject matter. It's about it. Yeah.
Okay, we have a final last question then.
Yeah, I have a question about transparency. I think so. There is a specific claim and a more general claim, and I want to see whether you would go for the more general thing. So let's say that connectives are not, sorry, they are topic transparent.
The truth functional extension
Yes.
connectives, yes.
Yeah. Would you make room for the claim? So would you say that they are transparent implicitly, or would you just make room for them being non-transparent in a non-topic way? So I was thinking about the following case. So imagine, so during the first talk, you mentioned case psychological experiments in which you have framing effects and some kinds of mistakes that people make, and that can give you reasons to go hyperintentional.
Yeah.
So one might imagine two connectives that have very different psychological properties. But that you might think they are topic transparent, but because of these different error profiles they have, if you want to treat Linda's case as a case in which you have to go hyperintentional, why not these cases?
Yeah. Good. Good. I have a chapter on framing effects in the book. And I have to grant that I only managed to capture using my topic sensitive account a certain kind of framing, which I think is structural, widespread, and important. But I don't claim that I captured that kind of framing. Because I think that that kind of framing must have to do with some other psychological factor coming in. And one better not invoke distinctions at the level of content to account for that kind of framing. It may have to do with the parsing of the syntax of the sentence, or with the cognitive representations that people associate with a certain sentence and so on. So yeah, I don't think that I can claim, so I don't want to claim that I can capture a certain kind of heavily psychological framing while at the same time retaining the claim that the truth functional connectives are topic transparent. So I'm going to say people can associate all kinds of mental representations to certain sentences and therefore be victims of framing, and I can't model that in my account. I'm just considering the point, given that I want to stick to the view that the truth functional connectives are topic transparent. Yeah.
Okay. So thank you so much, Franz. We ran out of time again.